Okay, hey, to everybody here and everybody online, we're gonna go ahead and get started. I just want to go over a couple of chapter housekeeping items. Next month's meeting will just be online. The presenter that we have is in North Carolina, so it'll be online, Zoom. The registration's up, feel free to, and then we'll be back as we were in June. Also, in addition, for anybody that's been following the API security and governance workshops that we've been doing, on May 9th is the third one, and Baljeet will actually be in town for that one, so it's available online as well as here. There's registration for both, so that's on May 9th, and then the regular meeting will just be online. You covered the microphones. Is there anything else we want to touch on, or? It has been, yeah, because of RSA.
Yeah, we have the upcoming ISACA meeting next week.
We do?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell us more about it, because I don't know. Yeah.
So next Thursday, if you haven't been to the combined ISACA meet, we have that over at KPMG. I don't know what the topic is. It'll be interesting, I promise it will be.
Yeah, wait, you mean the one with, is ISSA doing anything on it? Because I know Cloud Security Alliance is not, and Jackie normally is the driver for those. All right, well, like he said, next Thursday, there's a very good chance we're gonna have a collaborative meeting at KPMG. If it comes through, look for the email, check that. For anybody that doesn't know, ISACA-SD.org is the website. Just click on events, you'll see the calendar for everything that we've got. So other than that, I'd like to hand it over to Priya and let you get going.
Awesome.
Yeah, and thank you so much for being here, and thanks to Xiphon for help making everything possible.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Definitely excited to be here. And thank you for those that came in person, and especially those that are online as well. So my name is Priya Kumar. I am a senior manager at Moss. I've been with Moss Adams for about 12, 13 years now, give or take, in our risk advisory and compliance department. And I specifically specialize in SOC reporting. So whether you're an organization that never have went through a SOC report before, I'll help with like a readiness assessment, and then SOC 1, SOC 2s, and SOC 3s. And so for the next hour, we'll be talking about SOC reports. And I'll skip over to the agenda here. So really, SOC reports, what are they? How do you use a SOC report to help mitigate risks? How can companies improve their SOC to audit and stay competitive? How do you prepare yourself for a SOC report? Any changes in the SOC 2 reporting? And then just the evolving landscape of SOC reporting in general. Alrighty, so diving right into it. SOC reports. So SOC stands for System and Organization Controls. A SOC report is essentially an independent assessment of the internal controls of a service organization that helps mitigate the risks with the outsourced service that's being provided. And so when you think about it, many organizations, right, you rely on the integrity of your control environment to protect your business, to protect your customers. So you want to make sure that there's certain safeguards in place to protect your data, to process transactions, whatever that service offering is. That's the intention of what the SOC report is for. And so a SOC report is a way to assess those internal controls. Are they in place, and are they operating effectively? And so what these reports really do is help provide that confidence in the services that's being provided and the specific controls that's associated with that, that is ultimately helping you to mitigate the risks with using an outsourced provider. Okay. And so there are 3 types of SOC reports: SOC 1, SOC 2s, and SOC 3s. SOC 1s focus on internal controls over financial reporting. So it's really intended for those organizations that provide services that could impact They are clients' financial statements. So the most common example you can think of, right? Payroll processing. So you're using a third party to process your payroll. You want to make sure that they have certain safeguards in place when it comes to, managing deductions or how they appropriately adjust taxes and things of that nature. So those procedures that the organization would have in place for processing your payroll would directly impact your, internal controls over financial reporting. That's really what the emphasis of the SOC 1 report is. And so a lot of the times the viewers or the people who really care about the SOC 1 report, of course, is management itself, but it's really the customers and especially their first SOC 2. SOC 2 focuses on the non-financial reporting aspect. So it really emphasizes focus on how you're securing data and data processing. It measures the reliability of the system and those internal controls, basing it off of 5 trust categories. So security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. Each one of those categories essentially has predefined criteria where management then needs to ensure that they have controls in place to address those criteria. And the criteria are essentially like risk statements or objectives, if you want to think about it that way. And similar to the SOC 1, right? Who cares about these reports? It's management, of course, usually the customers and their customers' auditors. SOC 3 differs in the sense that it's more of a general use report. It's not a report that you generally rely upon to validate the integrity of their controls. But if you want your customers or someone else to understand, this is my control environment, this is my commitments and the service offerings that I have, this is the report that you would usually look at because it's more freely distributed. A lot of the times they'll use it as a marketing tool. You have vendors that put it on their website for the potential customers to read through. And that's really what that report is for. And so this table,
Priya,
yes.
Just out of curiosity, would it ever make sense to do the SOC 2 and the SOC 3? So you have the 2 for internal and then.
Yeah, so to do the SOC 2 and the SOC 3, you would have to do a SOC 2 in order to get a SOC 3. The SOC 3 is based off of the SOC 2 in the sense of the description and the control environment. The only component that is excluded is the actual testing performed, the internal controls that are being tested, the test procedures, and then the conclusions on it. Those are excluded, but you would never be able to get a SOC 3 on its own without getting a SOC 2.
So wait, Priya.
But to your question, yeah, it does make sense to get it. A little easier to do. It's not too much extra work, and you do have a freely distributable report you can put on your website. Or sometimes if you just want a potential prospect to understand your control environment without having to go through the NDAs and signing of a contract, and they're just curious, that's usually the report that you can hand over to them.
So if you were doing,
So wait,
would all the
Dave.
work pretty much be completed in the SOC 2,
Mhm.
and then you would just produce the additional report?
Correct. The efforts involved in a SOC 3 is just generation of the report, but most of the work is actually being done when you do a SOC 3.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Hey, Dave.
People use SOC 3 reports to distribute so that they can hide their internal controls. And they don't want to share them.
Not necessarily. I mean, if they do, I wouldn't know, but usually it's just so you just want to give a potential prospect who maybe doesn't have a contract with you, that doesn't have any requirement to look at it, to understand that, hey, these are the procedures and commitments that I have based on the services that I'm providing. And you can just kind of hand it out. A lot of the times with the SOC 1 and SOC 2, they're not freely distributed. You need to have an NDA or confidentiality agreement with them. There's usually some requirement. Even for us, if we get folks that ask for it, we can't distribute it out even without confirming with our client. So that's really just the ease of having that ability to present your control environment to others without having to go through the nuances a little bit. Yes.
One question, another SOC 2 and SOC 3 probably removed the qualified individuals who are the capability to review the report as a requirement or restriction on the report, correct?
Yeah.
SOC 3 and SOC 2.
Yeah, are you talking in the sense of reviewing it after the fact, or are you reviewing as an auditor who's going through the report?
Well, when you distribute,
Oh, okay,
when
distribution.
you distribute a SOC 2, right, it has that caveat. This should
Oh,
only
yes.
be provided to
Yeah.
individuals with the capability and control
Yeah.
to understand or review the report.
Yeah.
I just wondered if the SOC 3 has that.
It does not have that, no, because the intention is that it's more freely distributable. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
interdependencies on doing the SOC 1 before you do a SOC 2 and SOC 3, or we can do them independently?
Between a SOC 1 and SOC 2, there are no dependencies. You can do them independently, but in order to get a SOC 3, you need to do a SOC 2. Because yeah, so in the chart here, right, when you look at a lot of the focus, scope, and the domain areas that are covered, the SOC 2 and the SOC 3 are very similar. The only difference is that it's excluding the component where you're validating what those internal controls are, the testing of those procedures, and then the results of it. It is strictly just the control environment. That is why it's usually required that you need to do a SOC 2 in order to get a SOC 3, because you're still providing an opinion on that control environment. You're just not showcasing what those actual controls are. And that's really the difference there.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Are public companies required to make their SOC 2 public?
Required to make them public? No,
Yeah.
they're not.
Because
Yeah.
just because I asked, because I ran a lot of RMF projects, and the ATO authorizing individual always wanted SOC 2.
Yeah.
And we could just go to Microsoft or an Azure-based company and just pull it, or go to GCP or go to
Yeah.
AWS and pull it, but I never thought about it. Obviously, some companies are making them public. And
Yeah.
I guess, why would they do that versus why would they hide it?
Their preference on whether they want to or not. A lot of the times we'll see clients that, and I'm sure you've seen it, where they'll have a disclosure, an NDA disclosure, and you have to accept it to actually view the SOC report. That's the extent of maybe what they'll do. But the intention sometimes maybe is that you may not know whether you get a qualified or a modified opinion or not. So you may not just want to be handing them out, because a lot of the times if you do see a qualified opinion, there's going to be questions that are going to be asked. And so that's probably something where you want to control the conversation a little bit more than having it readily available. But it is something that's being asked a lot more of, and probably a little bit of a nuance to now, let's go through that conversation and let me send it to you and we'll send it back. Maybe you have to sign an NDA. It just kind of varies on the organization and how they approach it.
Sure, yeah, thank you. And to follow up to yours, maybe I'm kind of wrong, and not fully in line, but I always kind of viewed the SOC 2 as more of an internal report that may have sensitive information, of the SOC 3 is kind of like the attestation that would be provided more publicly.
Just put the mic closer to your face for the people online.
Okay.
Please, please, sorry. Please, yeah, they're putting in the chat, they're having a hard time.
My apologies. The question was, or more of a comment was, to follow on the previous, is that I view the SOC 2 more as an internal report that may contain sensitive information. And the SOC 3 more of like a light external facing attestation that we've completed this, it's our seal of approval and share. But to your point, yeah, I do see a lot of other larger companies like AWS or others that can just have a document compliance or certification page where you can download these others, you sign NDAs. You have to sign the NDAs, and it's more intimate, I guess. It's not really the right word. Am I right in that assumption, or am I kind of off by a little bit?
So in the SOC 2, it is not really meant for internal purposes.
The
Yeah.
people online are having a hard time even with the mic.
Okay,
So if you can kind of repeat the question or the
Okay.
comment.
awesome. So if I'm repeating it correctly, so your question was if SOC 2 reports are more internal, where SOC 3 is maybe a little bit more publicly facing. So SOC 2 is usually not an internal report. SOC reports in general, they're intended for your customers. They're not intended internally for management, because the driver of these SOC reports is because you have a customer that's asking it, because they're outsourcing a service, right? And so the SOC 2 is really asked for if they're trying to provide assurance over service commitments when it relates to the security of your data. How are you protecting the processing of that information? It's really a little bit more on the security landscape, maybe IT hygiene, you can say. And so that usually is a requirement that the customers are asking for. It's usually not management that needs those reports. And so the SOC 3 is just a scaled back version where it removes some of the sensitive information in the sense of some SOC reports may call out specifically like, these are the tools I use. The inspection tests may call out specific groups or IPs or something like that that they're actually looking at, not calling out the actual IPs, but a little bit more specific on the tools and technologies that they're using that you may not want to be freely distributing out to people. That's all excluded in the SOC 3 because it's just what they illustrate in their report narrative as their control environment. So it's just more information about, hey, this is the organization, this is what I do, this is my service commitment based on the service offering that I have, and that's just publicly available. Kind of think of it as like an extended about me on like a website sometimes. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna add that another way to see it is as a marketing tool.
Yeah.
So if you are shopping for service providers,
Exactly.
a lot of them have this SOC 3 report available for any potential. And the SOC 2 report, the way we use it as an auditor, related to cybersecurity or security, or infrastructure services, like AWS, or new cloud provider. And of course, the SOC 1 is already mentioned.
What's that?
Still having a hard time hearing?
Yeah, they are asking if you can repeat them, so. go ahead.
Hey, Dave.
Okay. So I'll just go on to the next slide for this one. That wasn't a question, but so this is just a comparison of the SOC 1 and SOC 2s and kind of what we've talked about. And I just to reemphasize, SOC 1 is a bit more fluid in the sense that it's the organization, it's management that's determining what the control objectives are. Whereas in SOC 2, your criteria are provided through AICPA based off one of those 5 trust categories. So it's more of, now you must have a control in place to satisfy these, where in the SOC 1, management dictates what their objective is, and it's usually based off of their client's ICFR. So usually in a SOC 1, you won't find controls like disaster recovery or mobile device management and things like that, because those really don't usually impact ICFR. So that's really the nuance between the 2 reports there.
Stop.
Before you go to the next thing, for everybody online, I forgot to mention it earlier, but our beloved chapter treasurer has some polling questions, and he's going to put one of those up. We need to go through those just as part of the CPE requirement, just to show the engagement. So Tim, if you can hear me, go ahead
Yeah.
and post that up, and we'll keep on keeping on. Well, here we can ask everybody here the question. What challenges does your organization face regarding SOC compliance? And your options are understanding the requirements, resource allocation, engagement stakeholders, implementing necessary controls, or other. So by show of hands here, understanding the requirements. Resource allocation, time. What challenges does your organization face regarding SOC compliance? And then it would be understanding the requirements, resource allocation, time, budget, people. That's usually the one that I kind of run into more consistently. Stakeholder engagement. Does anybody here run into that? And you're not on camera, so it's, you can, yeah, okay. And implementing the necessary controls. Got it. Cool. Okay. Thank you. Watch that.
Yeah.
Sure. That. Just keep clicking.
Oh.
Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you.
And that's gonna happen about 2 more times.
So we talked a little bit about SOC 1, SOC 2s, and SOC 3s. Now there's 2 types of SOC reports, a type 1 and a type 2. A type 1 is a point in time report. You're essentially validating the design of the control. So essentially, do you have a process? Do you have a control that formally documents that process? Great, you're good to go. A type 2 is focused on a point in time. So you're validating not only that you have a control design, but is it operating effectively? So you usually look at a period of time, usually at a minimum of 3 months, usually annually 12 months, a recurring basis, where then you go in and the auditor will ask you, do you have a process in place for this? You say, yes, we approve access for all new hires. All right, we're going to collect a few samples. Now show us evidence that that control was actually operating for that duration of the period. Okay, and if you're thinking about from a client user's perspective who's using it for SOX purposes or for their ICFR, usually a type 1 report won't be sufficient because you're not actually validating the operating effectiveness of what those controls are. So usually in those instances, it would at least need to be a type 2. And so SOC reports in general aren't just for technology corporations. There's a range of other industries that this applies to, whether they're financial institutions, benefit plan administrators, managed service providers. It ranges greatly. So, next, we'll talk a little bit about SOC reports and then how they're leveraged to mitigate risks, right? So why is it important? Why do we care? How do we use that to help us? Right. So if you think about it, in today's environment, right, we see more and more businesses that are starting to outsource services. And so in doing that, right, arises new risks because now you have an outside provider who has the responsibility to perform these operational duties when it comes to protecting your data and processing transactions. So that's where it gets really important for those organizations to provide assurance to their customers that they're controlling the risks and that there's still a sound environment in play. Right? Even when businesses are outsourcing certain functionalities or services, the board or management of those organizations still retain the responsibility of making sure that those internal controls are placed, at least staying informed to make sure that you're meeting your obligations of your clients. And in those instances, that's where the monitoring component really comes into play, right? Especially around vendor due diligence procedures. And so kind of, we were talking about it here, right? You're seeing more and more regulators and more customers that are now asking for these SOC reports, sometimes just to do business with them. And so that's where it becomes really important that now you're actually monitoring some of these SOC reports and really looking at, do you understand where my data resides? Do we understand if there are issues or concerns that may impact us and our ability to meet our service commitments to our clients? And so things that you would normally see, like simple questionnaires or contractual clauses, right? They help mitigate some risk, but they don't really address the fact of, what if there's a failure? How do you know that there is no impact to me and then ultimately impact to my customers? And so we'll talk a little bit more about vendor management and kind of, yeah.
But there are a couple of questions.
Oh, yes, please.
If this is a good time.
Yeah.
The first question from Ricky Hart is if there are any SOC 1 and or SOC 2 templates.
The reporting templates? No.
Yeah.
There's not templates. If you have access to the AICPA guide, they do provide descriptions of kind of what's required from like the narrative to the specific points of focus when you're looking at a SOC 2 and what is covered in it, but there isn't an actual template base where here it's like you fill it in and that's an example of a SOC report. That's usually not. Usually the auditor that you're going with for a SOC report will help provide some guidance. They'll usually have scrubbed versions that they can show you, but not something that's publicly accessible.
It's not that straightforward.
No, you can't make it that easy.
And then someone else asked if it's possible to share the recording of this on the slide deck afterwards.
Yeah, that's fine. I assume that's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
you're
assume
getting
that's fine.
compliments on
Yes.
the design.
Oh,
of
thank
the
you.
slides and the content that's in.
Perfect. Love it. Okay. And so,
Thank you.
awesome. So back to the vendor management. So it's really important to think through a vendor management program, right? That's where it's really crucial to make sure you're mitigating the risks, you're ensuring compliance, and it's just a means for monitoring, right? And so when you're thinking about reviewing a vendor SOC report, a lot of the times you'll see folks will obtain it, they'll look that you have it, and they're satisfied. but are you really looking at the details of the SOC report and understanding what's involved in it? And so listed here is just some of the considerations to think about as you're reviewing the SOC report. And so I'll go over a couple of them. So making sure you're looking at the type of report. Is it a SOC 1? Is it a SOC 2? What's really relevant based off of the service offering? What's the scope? You'll have vendors that have multiple services, so they'll have various different SOC reports. Make sure you're looking at the right one for the relevant service that you're relying on them for. What's the overall opinion of the report? Is it unmodified? Is it qualified? Are there things that you should be concerned about, right? Take a look at the period coverage. Does it overlap with your examination period coverage that you're concerned about, especially your financial statement audit? They have specific timeframes that you need to look at. So make sure you're looking at the coverage period of that report. And then kind of thinking through, the whole point of these SOC reports is to identify those internal controls. So are you looking to see, wait, which one do I really care about? Which one, if there's a failure, would it impact me and my obligation to my clients? So take a look at those, identify it, take a look to see were there any exceptions. Sometimes the exceptions could just be, hey, they missed something small. It may not be a concern, but are you evaluating what those concerns are? Another area to look at is the complementary user entity controls. So it's a section in the report, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later too, is the organization's basically saying, this is not my responsibility, it's yours as a consumer of this service. So make sure you take a look at that, because it sometimes may apply to you, it sometimes may not. So make sure you understand if you need to develop a control internally or not. And then another component is the subservice organizations. So each SOC report will list out if there's a subservice organization that they're using to help provide additional services on their behalf. And so a lot of the times the report will have a section that says complementary subservice organizational controls. Well, they'll essentially list out, hey, I may be using AWS, and these are the control areas that I'm placing reliance on for them. So they're kind of excluding this component from their SOC report because they're doing their vendor due diligence, reviewing their SOC report, and identifying, hey, these are the areas that we're concerned and we're relying on that vendor to operate. And then vendor management in general has multiple layers. And so when you think about onboarding of a new vendor, offboarding of a new vendor, right, think through, what do I really care about? So when you're onboarding them, think through the risks. What risks do I have bringing them on board? Are they a reliable vendor? Is there a reputational risk that's involved with them, right? What sort of due diligence documents do I need? Do I need a SOC report? Do I need to get their financial statements, right? Depending on the service, it may vary, but really kind of think through that. Same for offboarding, right? These vendors potentially have access to your data. They're storing your data. So you want to make sure that they no longer retain that access. If they have equipment, you may make sure that it's obtained and returned. And then you have vendors that you've been using on an annual basis, recurring year after year. What due diligence are you performing for them, right? SOC reports are usually one of the things, because it's a little bit more consistent. SOC reports usually happen on a recurring basis every year. So those are one of the most things you can rely upon to validate those internal controls. And so preparing a vendor management program, there's a lot of flexibility. You really dictate how you want to set it up. A lot of the times I'll have clients ask me, oh, I have so many vendors, I don't have the time to look through all of these. Well, there are options to now categorize your vendors, right? High, medium, low, critical, non-critical. It's kind of defining what those buckets are. And then basing off of that, if they're critical and they have access to data, I'm going to review them annually. If they're not, maybe I'll review them every 2 years, right? So that there's a little bit of flexibility there in kind of what you do, but it's important to make sure you're actually looking at your vendors. Okay. Yes.
How do you determine that an organization is a well-known accounting firm? How do you determine that? In my career, I've seen, eye rolls on some SOC reports.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, what would be your recommendation? How much money you spend on it? Is that it?
No, not necessarily. I mean, honestly, research and referrals are the best way.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So how do you know, I'm trying to remember your question. How do you know which external auditor to kind of go with, correct? And when you're trying to produce your SOC report. So honestly, I think personally, it's a lot more like referrals. And then doing a little research on them. A lot of the times, if you know someone who's done a SOC report with that specific auditor, right, you can ask them what their experience was, how it was, and try to gain some feedback there. Do a little bit of research on it too. I think me personally, it's kind of hard to say if I do a research and the top 5 come up, that may be the top 5 that you would pick. May not necessarily be the case. I think a lot of the times it's the person that you're dealing with. And then how much they're able to provide value and what they understand about your industry, and how much insight they have to kind of help guide you through that process, especially if it's your first time going through it. And then just thinking through how much involvement they have with you, I think is a good indication. But it's a tough answer. It depends answer. Yeah. I'll remember to try to repeat it.
Yeah, push that and try your outdoor voice and we'll figure this out.
I need to push still?
No, it's
Great, that's great, okay. I was wondering or assuming that SOC reports usually, no, I don't hear. If I receive a SOC report from an organization, I've seen anyway, other reports or other audits as well, ISO 2701, maybe somebody's using in this framework and have some credit there. Is that also will you also say that it's somewhat true that most organizations, if they are big enough to have SOC reports, that they also have other?
So if an organization's big enough to have a SOC report, they may undergo ISO or go through NIST or something. A lot of the times, if they're trying to build out their framework, they are. I think it just really depends on what the need is for it. Because a lot of these times yeah, it is. But a lot of the times, if you have a SOC report, it's understanding, do you need an ISO? Because an ISO's objective is different than a SOC report, right? An ISO is more about the security controls over your information security program for the business and for the organization, versus the SOC is specifically around the service offering. So it kind of depends on the need and what you're trying to portray and who you're trying to portray it to determine kind of what you need. In general, it's great to have a framework where you base your internal controls off of, and that's where you can pick, NIST or go off of COSO or COBIT or whatever it may be. So a little different. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think there's like an overlap in them in some ways.
Yeah.
But not to necessarily replace.
Yeah.
And you may run into regulatory requirements or something like that that will drive where an organization needs to go. Yeah. And our friend Tim would like to do another question. So if you can hear me, Tim, go ahead. There it is. Okay, the question is, what is your primary role in your organization? So I'll read these out just by a show of hands. The first option is, are you executive leadership? Got a couple, right on. Who here falls under compliance and risk management? Okay, that's who here is under IT and security? Ooh, that's the winner so far. Look at that. Okay, and does anybody else fall under other? Okay, yeah, you're definitely an other. Yeah, all guys named Dave are an other, right? Okay, sweet. Back to you. Thank you.
So you've probably heard me say the word subservice organizations a couple of times. So I have a little bit of a definition here. So it's a service organization used by another service organization to perform some of the services provided to the user entities that are likely to be relevant to those user entities' internal control. And so to think about it, if I'm an organization and I want to use a managed service provider to host and manage my IT infrastructure, right? They're my subservice organization because they're performing some sort of service on my behalf. You can go down into a little bit of a rabbit hole with this when you're reviewing the SOC reports, because then let's just say in that same scenario, you identify when you're reviewing this MSP SOC report, well, they're actually using another subservice organization, a data center, to actually host all the servers. So now your data is actually sitting with this fourth party, right? Which you probably wouldn't really consider unless you're actually reviewing these SOC reports and asking them the questions to really understand, well, where does my data actually sit? Right, so that's where it's kind of important to make sure you're really reviewing those in the SOC reports when you do your vendor due diligence. Yes.
Is it up to the company or the auditor to define the subservice organizations?
So it's both. The auditor will help you with, so is it up to the company or the auditor to determine who defines the subservice organization? So it's a combination of both. The auditor won't dictate it, but they will help guide you to identify the difference between what's a subservice organization and what's a vendor, because you'll be using other third parties to help provide services, but does it really impact the scope? So the service that you're offering, that you're doing the audit for, are those other vendors that you're now offloading some of their responsibilities and services to them? Those would be your subservice organizations. So how companies can improve their SOC 2 audit and stay competitive. So SOC 2 reports have become increasingly more important for tech companies, right? Technology is always evolving. There's more and more opportunities for customers to now outsource different parts of their business function. And you become more and more reliant on the controls at that third party. So again, this is where SOC 2 comes into play, right? The whole premise is to identify what are those internal controls at that service organization. Are they operating effectively? Because you are placing a lot of reliance on them to make sure they have a sound environment to protect your information and your data, right? And like we said, it's becoming more and more of an expected standard where you have a lot of customers that are asking you for this. If you think about when you're going through an RFP, a lot of the times one of the requirements is, do you have a SOC report? Are you planning to get a SOC report? Because that'll dictate whether they move forward with you or not. And so having that does provide you a competitive advantage, because you already know a lot of your customers are looking for this, or at least something similar for that. And so especially when you think about new companies that are coming into the market, right? You already got a handle on the fact that, you know, a lot of your customers are going to start looking for this. If they haven't asked now, they probably will. So getting a SOC report or something similar, right, does give you a little bit of a leg up. And so here we've outlined 6 things to really consider, whether you've never gone through a SOC report or you're really just trying to improve your current SOC report, and a little bit more emphasis on it. So it's understanding the SOC 2 requirements. So what's your scope, right? What are the service commitments you're trying to make to your customers? That'll help dictate what trust service criteria you need to scope in. Implementing robust internal controls. Understand what controls are needed. It's very easy to implement a whole bunch of controls, but they may not be necessary. What's the risk that you're trying to resolve here? And identify and create actionable controls that could be sustained. All right. And then leveraging technology. So when possible, leverage some automation tools just to make monitoring more efficient and easy. Engagement with experienced auditors. So pick someone that you understand knows your industry, can provide you value, can help guide you through it, especially if you've never done it or you just have a lot of questions there. Communicate values to customers. So use the SOC report as a marketing tool, right? It'll help differentiate you from your competitors because you're highlighting the commitments that you're making for security and privacy, right? So kind of leverage that to your advantage. And then utilize feedback. So gather insights from your clients on what their security concerns are, because the SOC report is for them, right? So it'll help you identify measures that you may need to implement to meet their expectations, of course, to the extent possible. How to prepare yourself for a SOC report. This is usually more so if you've never undergone a SOC report before, but it could still apply if you already have one. So thinking long-term, right? Design your controls to be scalable. It's really easy to think in absolutes and develop controls and various processes, but you may not be able to sustain them on a day-to-day basis. So make sure you're really thinking through what's realistic. And then who's going to be the reader of the SOC report, right? What information do they care about seeing? Again, these reports are for your customers, so make sure you have an understanding of what they're looking for. Right. Yes?
Good night. Why is SOC reports are the security controls come from, what's it, TSC, Trust Services?
Trust service categories, yeah.
Why, yeah, just saying this out, may sound sort of controversial, but
Yeah.
why would we rely on accountants to come up with what security controls are decent and not just rely on this or ISO?
I mean,
Please repeat the question.
Okay.
For us.
It's a
I
controversy.
didn't think it was gonna take 43 minutes for that question to come up.
I was waiting to ask.
So why rely on accountants to dictate security controls versus more technical controls like a framework like NIST? I mean, that's a great question that I don't know if I fully have the answer to, but I can speculate a little bit. Yes.
Well, I was gonna say, I've worked with auditors who have delivered SOC, and accounting firm is a great function for audit. But those security controls, as you say, are coming from the security industry.
Yeah.
But it's the auditing delivery that is the most beneficial way to deliver the comparison value of here's the control, here's your company, where are you?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And when you think about SOC reports before, right, when they were called SAS 70, a lot more of the emphasis was for the SOC 1s because it was more basis for internal controls or financial reporting, where a lot of these financial auditors were looking at it. And then you realize more and more that they're using these SaaS products where there's a technology component to it that needs to be evaluated and involved. And then over time, right, those components have been starting to be taken a look at. I mean, I think AICPA does use the COSO framework. So it does have a security component to it when it's developing what those criteria are. And the intention of that versus NIST is a little different. You could leverage NIST and then base your SOC controls off of it. It's just NIST isn't an attestation, it's more of a framework for security controls to follow, but you can leverage those NIST controls, apply it to your SOC report to meet the objectives of what a SOC is intended to do. Yes.
Or if you can, there's a really good comment on it that somebody dropped in the chat. So if you can help share this after. Because the AI CPA requires auditors to have competency, so a CPA firm should ensure their SOC auditors have IT domain expertise.
Okay.
Though many don't.
Nice little ending there. Yes.
And then I would come in. Yeah, so I was actually going to go down that line too. If you want to become a CPA, you have to take EEC. That's that whole computer component of it. And then two, also look at history of it all. All the auditing came from accounting and finance with an emphasis of IT that started out.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of historical parts of that as part of it. And then two, just like you mentioned earlier, just the structures there, the auditing structures there. I mean, you get something from this, who's going to audit? There's nobody there to do that.
Yeah.
You know, who has the competency?
Yeah.
This is why the Big Four have hundreds, thousands of experienced IT and cyber professionals within the ranks, because they're out there leveraging whichever one of those four it is, and many other companies, such as they're leveraging that company culture, the auditing function process, but just applying it to cyber or IT.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. Yes.
So let me tweak that just a little bit.
Okay.
What advice do you have for IT folks dealing with third-party risk management that may not be well-versed and certified in dealing with these controls, but they're responsible for, the stamp of approval before you can engage a vendor?
So in the sense of, understanding how to assess these third-party vendors for someone who maybe doesn't really know how to navigate that.
So specifically dealing with third-party risk management and analysts who really don't know what they're doing, how can IT be effective in moving through that process so that they can get approval to actually bring the vendor in and start reviews?
Yeah, that gets a little tricky because that's a lot more internal coaching and training and learning opportunities to understand, well, if I bring in this vendor, what does that pose? What sort of risk does that pose to me? It's not something that, you can kind of look up and completely understand and how to navigate. There are things that show you templates and versions of that, but it's more understanding and going through, I mean, I'm trying to say this, there are vendor management programs where it kind of lists out, these are the areas of concern when you're thinking about risk of bringing on a new vendor, and kind of navigating through that to have a conversation to see where does a risk lie? Is it a legal risk? Is it a reputational risk? Is it a security risk, right? All of those components, and then try to assess, well, if this were to fail, if there was a component of a breach or an incident that occurred where I could not find a way to operate, that there wouldn't be a leak, or my customers wouldn't be concerned, or I won't meet any of my obligations, kind of what would happen? What would be my compensating factor that I would have in place to identify that? It's kind of hard to say, oh, here's a book and you can read it and try to figure it out. It's more just trying to find out what more trainings that you can find on it, and honestly speak to someone, at least like an auditor or someone who can help navigate what the requirements are. Because there are so many templates that are out there that'll showcase you, but you have no idea what each one of those means. And so we need to have someone kind of walk you through and explain it to you. And a lot of the times that's where some folks may hire out externally, specifically for like a vendor risk assessment. There are so many tools that you can use for a vendor management program that'll lay out a template for you and ask you a questionnaire of, these are the things to consider. You answer yes or no based off of business units and kind of assess that way. But there still needs to be some sort of an understanding of kind of what it is that you're asking these questions to. But so I know I didn't directly answer your question on that one, but there are avenues, and I can, aside from that, I can help navigate on some of the things that I've seen that may help provide a little bit more detail.
Yeah, and one thing to add to that, and Tim, the chapter's treasurer who's online, knows way more about this than I do, but the CPA exam got refreshed a year ago or so, and it now requires certain IT knowledge baked into the exam so literally, if you're studying this at school, the curriculum now includes some of the IT risk management and IT fundamentals to start to understand this. So there has been, some things are slower, but it's starting to catch up in certain ways.
Love to see that catch up down to the analyst level. Because if you're in IT, normally you're dealing with an analyst, and they're the ones saying, hey, I need the controls here. And you're going, oh, I need to get it from my vendor. The vendor doesn't want to, open their kimono and talk about all their sub-service providers and all of this. And so I found that navigating that is very time consuming and very difficult. That vendor risk assessment process.
Yeah, I hear you, and there isn't like an easy button for it, but there is. At the end of the day, at least in my simple mind, we're talking about risk management. So if it's an analyst that's doing that risk management, they understand what that risk is, and the vendor's not saying it, it's not going to be the analyst's decision at the end of the day. It's really for them to understand what it is and communicate that up for someone else to make the decision. But if that analyst doesn't know what they're asking, hey, that's another question or another answer altogether. I mean, that has to happen. And those are kind of the pieces in all of it to connect the dots.
That's a historical challenge between technology and audit, because on one side you've got the auditor that doesn't understand the technology controls. So really speaking, it's almost a language barrier more than anything else. You've got auditors that need to be more technical and understand what's going on, and then you've got technologists or security professionals that need to grow and flex their business muscles and be able to better explain what they're implementing and the value that it's providing to mitigate those risks. So it's both sides really that need to close the gap. And I see it happen.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because I do see both sides recognize the challenge. But going into the engagements, trying to understand their level of, where are you at today, their level of understanding, because you also get reports back or like, you need to implement this control, and it has nothing to do with actual, the product or the function, or it's just, a check the box type solution. And so then there's education back and forth there goes as well. But meeting people where they're at,
Yeah.
a lot of patience and understanding it's a business relationship. It goes both ways. They'll get frustrated with us, and we'll get frustrated with them. It's a communication.
Yeah, and I think to that point, because dude, I couldn't agree with you more, that you have both those sides, but ultimately in the bigger picture, that those two sides can communicate well enough to identify what the risk is, communicate it, and then ultimately communicate that in terms of its impact to the business.
Well said.
Sorry, back to you.
No, well said. No, you got exactly to the point of assigning a point of contact, right? In an ideal scenario, you have one person that's dedicated to compliance, who understands what the asks are, who understand how to identify risks, right? And kind of navigate internally and externally and with the customers on how to approach it. But a lot of the times that's not the case, right? You may have a business person that's been tacked on to do this responsibility a lot of the times, and now they have their day-to-day jobs and are responsible for the SOC audit. And so that's, it gets a little challenging, but making sure that at least you're picking the right person that has an understanding of it as much as possible, or the ability to kind of navigate it and learn and try to figure out the answer when it's a little difficult to navigate through. And then just the coordination amongst all parties, right? It's not just the organization. You'll have the auditor that you're working with, you'll have the customer, you'll have the customer's auditors, and each one of them may have specific asks and requirements. So just making sure that there's communication and coordination amongst everyone. So you're meeting the expectations kind of on all ends as much as possible. So some of the changes in SOC 2. So in October of 2022, AICPA had released an updated SOC 2 guide. A lot more minor, small revisions on presentation in the SOC report, and there was a couple of things that were called out that may change some of the components in the SOC reports now, so we'll kind of talk through them a little bit. Okay, awesome. So the first one being the description criteria. So the first 4 items that I have bulleted there are more just nuances in the report on how things are described as far as your infrastructure software, how some of the mapping is done in the report. Nothing that actually changes how you would operate your controls or implementing controls of that nature. But there are 2 areas that I have listed out at the bottom that are added sections or added changes into the mapping. So the first one's around disclosure of system incidents and control deficiency considerations. So essentially it's saying if a system incident occurred that didn't affect the system in scope, there should be consideration given that if that incident occurred due to a control failure that also applies to the system in scope, there could be a possible vulnerability, and if that should be disclosed in your SOC report. So now there's just a section in the SOC report, it's optional, where if there is an incident identified, you would make that disclosure. What happened? What did you do? Was there any compromise? Kind of what was the result of it? So it's that option, but it's not required. And then the second area is a criterion carried out by third parties. So this update states that not all of the criteria may be relevant to you. In this scenario, it also could depend if you are outsourcing a function where you just can't meet a criteria. So for instance, if you're using AWS to host your infrastructure, there's a criteria in the SOC 2 that's specific to physical security around the server room where your data resides. Well, you wouldn't be able to have any controls in place because you've outsourced that to AWS. So this criteria is basically saying that you can no longer state, oh, this is not applicable, but instead you can either do 2 things. You can point to the fact, hey, I have this monitoring control where I'm reviewing their SOC report and call that out, or you can point to the fact where we talked about in the report, the complementary subservice organizational controls, where it says, hey, this is my subservice organization, it's AWS, and these are the areas that I'm relying on for them to address this criteria, and you kind of point to that versus just a blanket statement that, hey, this criteria is not applicable to me. And so that's really the difference now in nuances in some of the mappings.
Tim wants to post a third question. And he says this will be the last one. So we'll see. Oh, wow. All right. If you could choose one fictional character to be your mentor in your career, who would it be? Your first choice is Sherlock Holmes.
No one.
Okay, no one yet. Second one is Tony Stark.
Iron Man.
Yeah, Iron Man. Okay, sure. Hermione. What was the movie from?
Harry Potter.
Thank you. And Yoda. So I'll go through them again. Sherlock Holmes. If you don't know what you're looking for, get a better idea of what you're not looking for. Iron Man. Nobody? All right. Hermione. There you representing. I like it. And Yoda. Yeah, okay. Yoda's the winner locally here. Okay, and then let me do this. And then we do have a question online.
Yeah.
I'll read you. Let me. With the growing trend of compliance automation platforms offering real-time visibility into an organization's control environment, how do you see this influencing the role and perceived value of the traditional annual independent audit?
So that's a great question. We will actually talk about that in a couple of slides, so I'll hold off
Perfect.
on that one.
Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So the next component. So this component speaks on the trust service criteria points of focus. So if you ever have some light reading and you want to look at the guide, you'll notice that there's, for the criteria that are called out, there are specific points of focus, which essentially areas of risk statements that you're trying to address. And the guide was just updated to better clarify that you don't need to meet all of them. It's really understanding what is the intent of that criteria and do you have sufficient controls in place to address it. One of the most common ones that I always see, and I wrote the criteria down, is evaluate and communicate internal control deficiencies in a timely manner to those parties responsible, including senior management and board. So a lot of the times there's a specific component on the board. And so what if you don't have a board of directors, right? What do you do? And so it just provides better definition of what would be the board's responsibility. Now, what do you have internally in the organization that kind of mimics that? Because the whole intent is governance and oversight. So if there's a senior management committee or something like that internally, that would be your leverage to then implement a control focused on that, on who's kind of providing guidance and oversight to the organization. So these are the other kind of points of focus where they provide a little bit more clarity on what's required. The next one, again, it's just more definition in the guide on what confidentiality is and what privacy is. This can vary by organization. There are times where some organizations will classify some PII as confidential information, which is okay. I think it's just really understanding at the end of the day the type of data that system or the system in scope for the SOC report is being handled and who's handling it to kind of determine, is it confidential? Is it privacy? Which one do you scope in? I think the biggest nuance really is when you're trying to determine if privacy is something that's in scope. So a lot of the times the organization's responsible for security over how that PII data is being stored, but you may not actually be processing it or interacting directly with those end users whose PII is being collected. So a lot of the times in that instance, privacy may not even be relevant. It may just be security because you're not actually involved in the creating, collecting, transmitting, and using of that data. You're just storing it. So that's a good conversation to kind of think through with your auditors when you're trying to determine whether privacy is in scope or not, even if that software houses PII data. And so complementary user entity controls that we talked about a little bit before. So in simple terms, it's essentially a disclaimer that the organization is saying, this is not my responsibility, it's yours. And that's primarily because as you're kind of going through and looking at those criterias and trying to identify, what internal controls should I have in place to mitigate some sort of the risk, right? So if I'm an organization that's developing a monitoring software, and I create that software, I hand it over to the customer, and they actually install it on their infrastructure. I'm not responsible for it at all. They're responsible for granting access however they need to grant it, and provisioning of access. There's a criteria that specifically speaks to the provisioning and deprovisioning of access for external users. Now, you wouldn't be able to do that because once you hand off that release build, it is solely on the customer's responsibility to assign access, right? And so in those instances, you're basically carving out a section in the report, which is a complementary user entity controls, where you're saying, well, now you as a customer are responsible for ensuring the appropriateness of access, of who gets what role, and not creating any segregation of duties issues. And you're kind of putting it on them. Where it gets muddled a little bit on kind of what's a control versus what's a responsibility, because there are things your customers should be doing, like providing you accurate information and letting you know who should get access or who you should be coordinating with. But usually that's just a normal course of doing business. And a lot of the times your contracts or just onboarding procedures and guides will illustrate that, but it may not be a control that they need to implement to help satisfy a criteria and as a part of a service commitment. So that's really the distinction there. And so the guide has just some more clarity on that and kind of describing it. So the last little section here, it's just the evolving landscape of SOC reporting. So things that we've kind of talked about, right? There are a lot of new AI platforms. There are a lot of GRC tools that are being used to help automate the generation of the SOC reports, and kind of things that have been coming out and how SOC reporting is changing a little bit. We won't go into too much detail of it, but I'll kind of highlight some of the things that we're seeing more and more of. And so the first one, talking about SOC 2 and AI platforms, right? We're seeing an increasing number of AI platforms out there. And I think one of the challenging things for SOC report is, how do you gain reasonable assurance around the processing of some of those data? And so I've highlighted 3 items here on things to kind of really think through as you're trying to navigate doing a SOC report over this, right? So data quality, the processing integrity, the processing of the data to be complete and accurate. Do you understand the decision paths that are in play here? The model explainability, really understanding sometimes where your data sits. So AI platforms do have the ability, a lot of the companies, you can either develop your own large language models or you can outsource it. So it's really important to understand, where is that information lying? Is it with that company or is it with another third party again? And then there is no concrete answer of how it should be done when you're using AI platforms, but it's really just understanding that decision path and really understanding the security over that, right? The security over the collection, the security over the processing, what's being used, whose hands are in the cookie jar essentially, and all of that aspect, and trying to build and tailor your controls around that. And then of course, regulatory compliance too. If that platform houses any personal data, should you be compliant with GDPR or CCPA? It's just things to kind of think through as you're navigating SOC reports for that. And then SOC 2 and GRC platforms. So we see more and more now that companies are starting to utilize these GRC platforms who can automate the report generation process. And really the intention, right, is they want to centralize and automate their compliance requirements. So whether they're following NIST or ISO or HITRUST, you have a place where you can aggregate your control set and kind of map it out to all these different criterias. But there are things that you still need to be mindful of when you're going through that process, right? Understanding the functionality of the tool and how the integration is set up. A lot of the tools have some built-in APIs with other products that you may be using that you can leverage to now automatically pull data that you may need for your SOC audit, right? Understand that they're pulling from the right instance, they're pulling from the right repository. Make sure that setup is correct. Right, review and design of reporting controls for completeness, relevance, and ensure key risks are addressed. So at the end of the day, I kind of say garbage in, garbage out, right? Whatever you put into it is what you're going to get. So make sure that the controls that you have established are what's relevant to your organization. A lot of the times these tools have an out of the box set of controls. May not all be applicable to you. You may need to tailor it. You may need to add some more. So make sure someone's actually looking through that and it's not just one generic list of SOC controls. Okay. Assuming responsibility for program design, operating effectiveness, and evidence collection, which we've kind of talked about already too, is making sure even though that these automated procedures are pulling in the data, is it still accurate and complete, right? Did someone go in and do a check for that? A lot of the times it's pulled in and the tool will automatically mark it as, oh, it's complete, but do you know it's actually pulling from the right tool, right system, right document? So make sure that someone actually is assessing that. And then prepare tailored risk assessment policies, procedures, and materials. So again, sometimes these tools have an out-of-the-box feature where you can plug and play some of your risks, identify the threats, your mitigating factors, right? You still probably need to tailor it depending on your organization. So maybe too extensive, you may need to expand on it, identify additional threats or risks. So take a look at that and tailor it as you need. And then conduct due diligence and annual reviews of the SOC 2 report. So these GRC platforms, they become one of your vendors that are housing your data. So are you doing due diligence over them? So make sure that's a component that you're looking at. We've kind of gone through evaluating the completeness and accuracy of data. And then lastly, work with the SOC 2 provider for carve out or inclusive methods. So that's really if you're using a subservice organization. If they have a SOC report, you usually carve it out. So you don't need to have the auditor validate the internal controls that subservice organization has. But if they, let's just say they didn't have it, they didn't have a compliance report, they don't have any questionnaires where you get comfort, you take an inclusive approach where they're not only validating your controls, but they're also validating the controls at the other subservice organization. And so make sure you have an understanding of that. That'll tailor how the platform is set up. I think at the end of the day, having the platforms doesn't really take away from the need of having an auditor to come in and perform the SOC report. I think it really just depends on how comfortable you feel around this tool and what you're really looking for. Sometimes we'll have instances where the clients just want a SOC report. They don't really care the details of it. They just know the customer's asking for it, and these platforms are an easy way to do that. But a lot of the times you still want to make sure you're reviewing and assessing the right things.
I think from a security perspective, it's important to realize that when you get these platforms, they don't just do all this stuff for you.
Yeah.
Regardless of what it says, if you're not actually fulfilling the tasks that's on that GRC list, then they aren't happening. Yeah. So you can get the Dradas and of the world, and yeah, sure, you're SOC 2 ready, but that doesn't mean a whole lot if you're not actually fulfilling the actions required by that SOC 2 governance.
Awesome. And another two things that we see popping up a little bit more and more is SOC for cybersecurity and SOC for supply chain. Very specific, but SOC for cyber is a framework that helps organizations assess and report on their cybersecurity risk management policies. So I'll read off some of the benefits here, right? So you demonstrate how you protect your information and manage cybersecurity risks, improvements to your cyber practice, better communication between like IT and management, and then assurance for stakeholders. So this report is usually just for internal use, usually just for management. And then they base it off some sort of a framework that you may have internally, whether it's NIST, ISO, COBIT, HITRUST. That's usually what it's based off of. Unlike your standard SOC 1, 2s, and 3s, it does not need to be for a service organization. It could be for any organization. And then second one is SOC for supply chain. So it's a reporting framework designed to help organizations assess and communicate the effectiveness of their supply chain risk management practices. So it's very similar to a SOC 2 report, same trust service criteria. The only difference is it's tailored specifically for producers, distributors, and manufacturers. So the layout looks the same. It's just the control environment and description is specifically tailored to your supply chain. And then lastly, something that we call SOC 2 Plus. So SOC 2 Plus is a SOC 2 examination that includes an additional opinion about matters that are not normally within your SOC 2 report. So essentially, it's a better way to see how organizations perform against some of these other frameworks or compliance frameworks by mapping it. And so in a SOC 2 plus, you also are being provided an opinion on one of these areas you're mapping to. So let's say you covered SOC 2 and you want to overlap that with high trust. It's not a full-blown high trust assessment. What you're really doing to see is how do your internal controls specifically on what you're looking at for SOC 2 align with compliance requirements for high trust, and then they give an opinion on it. That's essentially what a SOC 2 report is, and these are some of the most common ones that we see that there is that mapping to. There is also the option, it won't be called a SOC 2 plus, but where you can do a mapping in the report itself in a SOC 2, where if you just want to showcase, hey, a lot of my controls comply or align with NIST standards, you would have a mapping component that would list out the NIST requirements and then map the SOC controls to those specific requirements to showcase, hey, these controls I'm testing align with NIST requirement XYZ. But there is no opinion on that. It is solely just a mapping exercise. So it could raise some questions if you see, if there's a control we didn't test, you may have a control in place in your environment that aligns with the NIST requirement, but it won't be mapped to there. So it can look like a gap, but it may not necessarily be. So pros and cons to having that, but sometimes there are questions that customers get in their, organizations get in their questionnaire on kind of, are you aligning to a specific framework? So it's just another way to showcase that.
Question for you on that.
Yeah.
Like in a Drata or a Vanta, like you were describing earlier, we've had clients where, say we're helping them with a SOC, but then that platform's trying to sell more stuff. So it says, hey, you're, you know, based on this, you're 80% of the way towards this one. You know, do you want to do that too? Is that an example of what you're describing here, where that tool would be doing a cross mapping?
In a sense, yeah. I think for the Dratas and the Vantas and stuff like that, they have that built-in functionality to kind of map to other frameworks. It is a similar concept, but very narrowed. We wouldn't do a full-blown assessment over it, but yeah, it is just a mapping exercise.
Got it.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'll try to repeat it.
Or non-technical research is if you use your outdoor voice, we're fine. Okay. And the further back you sit, the more outdoor you are.
Unless your next slide says AI on it.
Yeah.
My question becomes, somebody from the AI security mapping consortium with CSA. And I swear a third of the controls have to do with supply chain, derived data sets. Yeah. So is there going to be a SOC for AI, or it's got to happen? You know,
I'm assuming it will. I have not seen anything through AICPA for that yet. I mean, with the amount that AI is popping up, I'm sure there's going to be some component of it, but I think for now, a lot of folks are gearing more towards the processing integrity TSC that's called out to cover AI. But outside of that, it's up to AICPA to see what they do or not. Yeah.
As soon as it's profitable enough.
Yeah.
That is surprising. I thought
We'll see.
no.
Nothing yet.
Probably do a SOC 2 plus the ISO 42001.
Well,
Until the AICPA
Yeah.
releases something.
Perfect.
I guess.
Yes.
Are there any upcoming changes to the TSCs themselves over the next year or two on the roadmap?
Nothing that I've heard of yet. Yeah. The last update that came out, 2022, maybe prior to that, was more emphasis on vendor management and risk assessments. I know they had updated it. Now the risk assessment is specific to call out fraud, where I know gets a little complicated because a lot of the times the service that's in scope for it, you may not have any fraud risks. A lot of times it lies with your financial statement audit. So that's an area where it's still a little tricky, but nothing that I've heard of yet. Perfect. And so that does wrap it up as far as things that we've seen that are popping up a little bit more and more. I know that was at a 30,000 foot view, but if there are any questions to any of these specifically, I'm more than happy to answer them. And if I can't, I will find you someone to answer that question. Yeah.
In your experience, have you seen companies shift their mindset around security after going through SOC reporting?
Yeah, And SOC report, because it's not as extensive as some other security frameworks, it's a good starting point when you're trying to build out your security posture. And to be honest, I think I've seen a lot more of a shift with all the breaches that have been popping up. And now folks are more and more aware of, I should probably get some IT security controls in place now. And SOC reporting, really the driver of those that it's coming up more and more is the customers. The customer is more concerned. The customer is more aware of, oh, like where is my data actually residing now? I should probably know that. That's really what the driving factor is. But I honestly think it's a lot of the breaches that are coming up that folks are like, I need to put something in high gear now. Because the pros and cons of the SOC report, right? It's not that in-depth and not that technical. When you read the guide, it's very ambiguous. It's open for interpretation and it provides those points of focus to help guide you, but it doesn't address all your security concerns, right? It's specific around the service that's being provided. Perfect. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate